before going into what the role of CMS and AEWA is, it would be interesting to first know where does AEWA fall in the framework of CMS. AEWA, like the other instruments, which are the agreements and memoranda of understanding established under CMS, are established based on Article 4 of CMS, which provides for measures for the conservation of migratory species of wild animals, which are listed under CMS's Appendix 2. So there's an Appendix 1 for threatened or globally threatened species covered under CMS, and then Appendix 2, which covers the species that have an unfavorable conservation status and which would require international agreements for their conservation and management. So basically, this is the framework under which AEWA is established, along with other instruments. And there are 9 of these instruments which are relevant for bird conservation, 5 of which are relevant for the African region. And of these, only 2 are relevant for the countries which are participating in the current training course. And these are the Memorandum of Understanding for the conservation of migratory birds of prey in Africa and Eurasia. That is what we generally called the Raptors MOU, based in, with the Secretariat based in Abu Dhabi. And then we have the Agreement on the Conservation of African Eurasian Migratory Water Birds, acronym AEWA, which is what I would speak about more. So basically all these instruments established under CMS function in more or less the same way, with the same principles and approaches. And so they all would establish the basis for conservation of the migratory species. So in this case, migratory water birds, which they cover with the overarching aim of conserving, maintaining these species and their populations at a favorable conservation status throughout the entire range of the species, hence the migratory aspect. So you have to conserve them across the entire range. And CMS and its instruments are the only ones which are designed specifically for conservation of migratory species in their natural environment. So that is really a general global niche for CMS in conservation worldwide. So coming back to implementation, how are these implemented at the international and national level? Like I already mentioned, they all more or less function in the same way. So if we go to AEWA, for example, AEWA would establish the principles for conservation. So it provides legal provisions for the conservation of the species covered under AEWA through the agreement text, so the AEWA text. And next to the AEWA text, you, of course, like in the other instruments, have the species which it covers. And these are categorized based on the level of threat to these species or how restricted their habitats are. And along with the AEWA text, so these legal provisions provided under the AEWA text, you have an AEWA action plan, which is annexed to the AEWA agreement. And it's quite crucial for every party to know the existence of these documents, because the AEWA action plan then strengthens and guides the provisions provided under the AEWA text. So these provide detailed conservation measures to be conducted under 4 broader thematic areas, including species conservation, habitat conservation, management of human activities, research and monitoring, education and information. These areas are the key areas under which activities need to be conducted by each of the contracting parties in order to deliver the provisions made under the AEWA text. So it's a very dynamic instrument in the sense that the AEWA, the annex to the AEWA text, which is the AEWA Table 1, which provides the status of the population. So each species has certain populations covered under AEWA. Sometimes not all the populations of a given species would be covered. So for all these populations covered under AEWA, they are categorized under the AEWA Table 1 into, depending on the threat status, from column A, which is the most threatened. So for example, all the species, AEWA species, which are under CMS Appendix 1, threatened species, are covered under AEWA column, Table 1, column A. And the species with restricted number of individuals in the population, so from 10,000 to 25,000, are in category B of column A. So again, more threatened species. And it goes on and on in different categories. I would not elaborate on the categories, it would take a bit more time. So it's just to say that this categorization changes over time as the conservation measures are being done. Some of the status of the species improve, and then they're moved from one column to the next or taken off altogether, which is rare. But then, yes, it's a dynamic table, and the parties have to, and the agreement is dynamic in this sense. So the parties have to keep track of this at the national level, and I'll come back to that when I go to how is this done at the national level. So basically, the provisions in the AEWA action plan define what needs to be done for these different categories of species, which are listed under the AEWA Table 1, from stricter measures, for example, prohibiting the taking of birds and their eggs, prohibiting deliberate disturbance, and prohibiting possession or utilization of or trade in the birds or their bird parts, to other milder conservation measures on sustainable use, for example, where there's less threat to the species. In addition to the AEWA action plan, it sounds like it's getting a little bit complicated, but it's just an additional layer of support and guidance provided by an AEWA strategic plan, which is established, was adopted. The most current version was adopted in the 7th meeting of the parties to AEWA and runs for the period of 2019 to 2027. And this provides more of an operational guideline on the implementation of the agreement on the 5 objectives. Again, you would see it's just the key areas where activities or action has to take place: of species conservation, sustainable use of species. I'm just shortening them here because the formulations of the objectives are longer. The third one is the establishment of a network of sites of international and national importance at the flyway level, so across the entire range of the species. Habitat conservation in the wider environment, so moving from site level to the wider environment, like broader habitats, and mobilizing resources, of course, human, financial, and material resources. And then we have the AEWA Plan of Action for Africa, which is my favorite. This was developed in the framework of the AEWA African Initiative as an additional guideline tailor-made for the African region to guide the implementation of the AEWA strategic plan in the African region. So basically here we are defining a series of actions and processes that need to be implemented under the different objectives or towards attaining the different targets of the AEWA strategic plan in the African region. And of course, being tailor-made for the African region, there's a focus on capacity building, for example, both institutional, administrative, and technical scientific capacity building. The involvement of local communities in conservation, because the use of migratory water birds and their habitats is a crucial component that has been recognized and needs to be taken into consideration. And also forging and promoting, strengthening collaboration at all levels. So at the national level, between governmental agencies, between governments and non-governmental agencies, and between various stakeholders at the national level, but also transboundary and at the flyway level, so across borders, which is the whole concept and principle behind flyway conservation. There's also a wide range of other tools provided in the framework of AEWA to guide and support activities for conservation on the ground by the parties. So we have, as defined by paragraph 7.3 of the AEWA action plan, annexed to the AEWA text, as we already mentioned, we're supposed to develop conservation guidelines to help parties in various areas of conservation. So for example, the single species action plans, which most people would have been familiar with and heard about, which is one of the signature tools of AEWA, towards conserving particular species or their populations over a period of time, especially mostly the threatened species over a period of time across the entire range. So these tools are very useful. They are developed in the framework of this paragraph 7.3 of the AEWA action plan. And we also have, for example, ranging from legal guidelines or legislative guidelines to other guidelines for other kinds of action, like national action at the national level or on the ground. We also have initiatives like the AEWA African Initiative, which I already mentioned, which are really targeted towards guiding and supporting the African region where we've seen a gap in implementation. We have the European Goose Management Platform, which is for ensuring coordinated harvest management restricted or dedicated to the European region. We have an awareness raising campaign, which we call the World Migratory Bird Day. It's a global campaign that helps with awareness raising on migratory water, on water bird conservation rather. And this is conducted in collaboration with CMS. And we also have partners on the ground like BirdLife and Wetlands International that support with conducting activities at on the ground worldwide. And it's also done now combined with the Americas region, so not just the AEWA region, but it's a worldwide campaign. Another support mechanism I would like to mention is a technical support unit, which is provided by the government of France in collaboration with the government of Senegal. So it's a team of technical experts that provide support for implementation of the AEWA Plan of Action for Africa, which we've mentioned a few times already. So those are basically the frameworks and tools and mechanisms established at the international level or at the flywheel level in the framework of the agreement to guide the parties in implementing the agreement and its provisions. In addition to that, the latest version of the AEWA strategic plan and action plan, and sometimes resolutions also mention where AEWA contributes to the delivery of provisions on the other global frameworks, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, Aichi targets, the Strategic Plan for Migratory Species developed on the CMS, and the Ramsar Strategic Plan, just as examples. And this is very useful for parties because then they're able to compare and collaborate with the colleagues or institutions which are responsible for these other delivering provisions under these other frameworks, and also helps in fundraising efforts as well. Implementation at the national level. All of this has to be translated then to implementing the provisions at the national level. And it sounds basic. The contracting parties are expected to mainstream these international obligations into national instruments, be it domestic legislation, policies, strategies, action plans, projects, whatever, and implement the measures on the ground. It goes without saying that they have to ensure to provide the necessary human resources. And in this regard, at the least, the party should designate its official focal points. So we have the national focal point, the focal point for communication, education, and public awareness, CEPA focal point, and the technical focal point in the framework of AEWA, who would work together then with other partners at the national level. And this already makes a very strong human resource base for the implementation of the agreement at the national level. And with regard to transposing or translating, mainstreaming the provisions from the international treaty, which is AEWA in this case, into national legislation, like we already mentioned, AEWA is a dynamic instrument. At every meeting of the parties, we have amendments made to the agreement and its annexes or its annexes. So maybe some species have moved from being less threatened to more threatened and the other way around. How do you translate this into your national legislation? So each party has to be ready to, after each meeting of the parties, take the amendments to the provisions, review your national legislation, and then see what needs to be updated or amended, or what new domestic legislation or provisions have to be developed in this, depending on what the outcomes of your review process are. In the case of the African parties, then with the AEWA Plan of Action for Africa, it's a region-wide plan. There are priorities, of course, which are not relevant for, or actions that are not relevant for certain countries. So develop your national plan of action, implementation plan to deliver this plan of action in your country. And this serves as a very useful tool then to facilitate action together with partners, fundraising, and so on. Same with the international and single species action plans we mentioned. Once the international framework has been developed, then you have to develop your national species action plan based on that, what priorities have to take place in your country. When we say when the species action plans are developed, we establish or convene an international species working group. The country would have the obligation then to designate its representative on this international working group, without which you would not be participating in this flyway scale conservation. You would not be kept informed, and you would not be aware of conservation efforts or contribute to these conservation efforts, most likely at the flyway level. And then at your own level in your country, create a national working group in addition to that, that would not necessarily for a single species, could be a species working group, which would get experts based on the species that are species action plans which are relevant, and they would work on ensuring that actions are being conducted, fundraising and liaising with other experts across the flyway to ensure that the efforts are not just going on but are coordinated, which is the whole idea of the flyway conservation. Very much. After over 2 decades of existence, definitely there are success stories to showcase in the framework of AEWA. For a start, through the prescribed and established dedicated processes and tools in the framework of AEWA, these have provided an effective way of achieving conservation of migratory waterbirds and even the recovery of some species at the flyway range. So this is straddling basically jurisdictional boundaries, and no country could have achieved this individually. If doing similar conservation efforts on an individual basis, you would not be able to achieve as much as has been achieved in the framework of this coordinated and concerted action framework. Over the last decade, basically the overall status of migratory waterbirds populations listed under AEWA has improved overall, as defined in the last conservation status report provided to the 7th meeting of the parties in 2019. And we have nearly 75% of the AEWA populations showing a positive trend, which is good news in the framework of conservation of migratory waterbirds covered under AEWA. Another area is under the monitoring of migratory waterbirds. Data reporting and analysis has improved over time through promoted coordinated waterbird monitoring efforts, as well as targeted capacity building efforts. And capacity is one of the areas where we mentioned, for example, in the African region, where a lot of action has taken place in the framework of AEWA, or the framework of the AEWA African Initiative. In this area, we have under AEWA achieved 116% increase in the number of AEWA listed populations whose status is being assessed on the basis of regular monitoring data, that is compared to 10 years ago. So this is another significant increase, positive trend in improvements. One of the emerging issues AEWA has been addressing over the past decade and more is the issue of lead ammunition. So the use of lead shot for hunting in wetlands. Lead ammunition basically causes environmental heavy metal pollution and leads to poisoning and mortality of an estimated 1 million waterbirds only in Europe, besides other sublethal effects across other waterbird populations. And this issue has been going on for a while. Over the years, at every AEWA meeting of the parties, this crops up as an urgent issue to address. And so far, 25 contracting parties to AEWA have phased out the use of lead shot for hunting in wetlands. And seeing where this issue comes from, we would say this is good progress on the use of lead shot for hunting in wetlands. In the framework of AEWA, through a established structured approach for migratory waterbird species, for the conservation of, migratory waterbird species in an unfavorable conservation status. So through our species and action and management planning process, we have managed to achieve the set objectives for some of the species for which we established single species action plans. And so the populations have either increased and or their status on the IUCN red list has improved. So this is significant progress with clear indicators showing, demonstrating the progress. In the framework of AEWA as well, a structured approach was established for setting up the network of sites of international and national importance. We mentioned that as one of the objectives of the AEWA strategic plan at the flyway level, of course. And this was done through coordinated efforts by the AEWA Secretariat along with a host of other partners in the framework of a 4-year UNEP GEF African Eurasian Flyway project, which ran from 2006 to 2010. And under this, a critical sites network tool was established, which basically brings together data on waterbirds and their habitats from different portals, for example, the International Waterbird Census and the Ramsar Sites Database, just as 2 examples. And this makes the information available in one portal for use by decision makers on the key sites of international and national importance for waterbirds in their countries. And this tool is being developed being maintained in the framework of AEWA because it needs constant updating or regular updating to make it alive and dynamic with the changes in the bird population status and the habitat conditions and status. In the framework of the African Initiative, I would name a few achievements or successes that. The African Initiative was adopted at the 4th meeting of the parties in 2008, so it has been running for about a decade. And over this decade, we've recruited 14 new parties in the African region, which is a significant improvement in recruitment rate, we have to say, in the framework of AEWA, because the older the instrument gets, the slower the recruitment rate becomes, because the parties which had most interest have already adhered, and then it's a struggle, and with the dynamic and heavy process at the level of establishing or accession or accession of such an instrument, which is has a very heavy legal basis at the national level, it does take time for recruitment of one contracting party. So this is a quite significant success in the under the African Initiative. For capacity building, a lot of effort has been put on this, as already mentioned, and through a tool which was developed under this UNEP-GEF project as well, the Flyweight Training Kit, the AEWA Secretariat has managed to systematically conduct regional training of trainers courses over the past years. And we've done this for Francophone African countries in West and Central Africa very recently, and in the past for Anglophone Southern Eastern African countries, and even for Lusophone Africa, the Lusophone, so Portuguese-speaking African countries. And the idea is to establish a network of trainers equipped with knowledge and capacity on delivering flyway conservation for the conservation and sustainable use of migratory waterbirds and their habitats across the African region, but also able to deliver similar trainings at the national level. We've also focused on enhancing capacity at the institutional level, and this has been done through, for example, a tool, the CMS family focal point manual, which was developed in collaboration with the CMS Secretariat, and we've delivered trainings on this, dedicated training on this, but as also at every preparatory meeting for the African region, when we prepare for the meeting of the parties of AEWA, we also use this tool to again enhance capacity of the administrative personnel, so the national focal points involved in implementing the agreement. What are the challenges? Of course, despite the successes, we continue to face enormous challenges with implementing at all levels. The main one being, of course, limited resources. Goes without say, financial, human resources, limited staff, continuous change and turnover in staff at the national level and otherwise. So it makes it difficult for continuity in the implementation. Human, financial, and material resources are lacking in the African region, of course, but agreement-wide generally. So this is one of the major limitations to implementation. Limited awareness on the value of waterbirds and wetlands, and this, of course, results in limited understanding on the need for conservation of these resources. And this goes a long way with the low perceived value of waterbirds and wetlands, despite the huge range of values they offer, from social, cultural to economic value. So the waterbird and wetlands conservation continue to receive low attention at the national level and at other levels when it comes to provision of resources as well. There's a limited capacity we already addressed. Despite the trainings we've been delivering and the efforts made in improving capacity, there is still there's still limits to capacity, especially in the African region. And this limits the availability of skills for conservation and management of waterbird populations and their habitats. Weak governance was also pointed out, including legislation and coordination, in the sense that the time needed, we mentioned that the agreement is dynamic, same with all other multilateral environmental agreements. Whenever decisions are made at the meeting of the parties, the conference of the parties, and meeting of the signatories, you need to mainstream these into national legislation. These processes at the national level are often cumbersome and time-consuming, especially for legislative and decision-making modifications. As such, enforcement or compliance becomes limited if these are not able to be translated into national legislation, and this already would limit the country with regard to compliance. If you cannot update the list of species, which are the list of priority species which need to be conserved, then you are not complying with the strict conservation of all the AEWA column A species, for example, once there has been an update in the AEWA table 1, for example. So it makes it difficult to comply in that case. So these are some of the limitations that they have at the national level. And also, I mentioned coordination under this. Sometimes, or quite often, the different institutions and stakeholders are responsible at the national level for implementing various aspects of the agreement. So you might have the wildlife department responsible for implementing AEWA, but you would have issues to deal with dealing with infrastructure or with environmental conservation overall, which are maybe under other departments like the Ministry of Environment and so on. So if there's limited coordination between these institutions, then it makes implementation, it also limits implementation at the national level. And I have political instability, which of course compromises conservation priority against other priorities like security priorities, and in addition limits access to monitoring habitats and the species. It destabilizes the existing governance where it is, the structures as well, and creates humanitarian crises that may further exacerbate pressures on natural resources, including migratory waterbirds and the wetlands which they depend on. I think those are the key challenges I would say are relevant in this case. We mentioned there's been progress and success in the implementation, but when you look at the overall goal of AEWA strategic plan, that is maintaining or restoring migratory waterbird species and their populations at a favorable conservation status throughout their flyways, this was assessed at the 7th meeting of the parties. And based on the assessment, it was realized that this has not been achieved, which sounds a bit discouraging. But this is a very tough goal to achieve overall. However, there has been progress registered towards implementing the targets of AEWA's strategic plan objectives. So we said there were 5 objectives with a number of targets established under each objective and indicators by which we would determine the level of implementation of each of the targets. And the assessment of these targets showed that they have been achieved on an average basis, which is fairly good enough for the age of the agreement. 30% of the targets were reached or showed significant progress, and another 27% of these targets showed good progress, which is quite a good average achievement. And there was a decline in the proportion of AEWA strategic plan targets which had made limited progress in achievement or which had not been assessed in the past at all. So like we said, that is on an average, where the objectives and its targets are being achieved on an average basis. In addition to that, it's been noticed that there's an overall increase in the increasing trend in the delivery of the targets over time. And this indicates that the contracting parties are proactively working towards safeguarding migratory waterbirds in line with the aims of the agreement. So that is a positive trend, which is good. I can also mention here that 3 key areas which were assessed as still requiring substantive work to meet with the AEWA strategic plan objectives included providing full legal protection to the column A species, developing and implementing single and multi-species action plans, and implementing the AEWA's communication strategy, including securing resources for the communication strategies implementation. And of course, in the new generation of the AEWA Action Plan and Plan of Action for Africa, a lot of emphasis is being placed on these aspects to further implementation. Are there geographic variances in implementation? Of course, yes. With the majority of populations with no trend estimates or with poor knowledge on the waterbird population status being from West Asia and the Afrotropic region, except for South Africa and the Atlantic coast of Africa, implementation has also been lagging in these regions, and this assessment is coming from the AEWA Conservation Status, 7th version of the AEWA Conservation Status Report, which was submitted to the AEWA MOP 7 in 2019, so fairly recent. Within the African region, in addition, there are significant gaps in the Central African region, where we have bigger gap in membership, and this, of course, limits implementation where there's no obligation to implement the agreement. But we also have limited engagement and implementation from the existing contracting parties in this region. And we really are trying and pushing hard to involve the Central African region more, to recruit more parties from the region, from the sub-region. And in the framework of the African Initiative, a lot of effort is being made. In the Central African region, I have to say some of this is due to the overall political instability, which comes along with security issues, as we mentioned above, with the challenges to implementation. So it's not sometimes that the parties do not want to do this, or they don't want to implement, or they're not engaging themselves in, but they are limited by these other existing circumstances. As I mentioned, the African Initiative does provide the needed attention and support to boost implementation in the African region. And we try as much as possible to prioritize actions across the region as per the needs. So even across the sub-regions where more action is needed, and in certain regards, we do prioritize as well, sub-regionally. In the framework of the African Initiative, so our Plan of Action for Africa, the AEWA Strategic Plan, and even from the AEWA text and with Action Plan, we keep calling on collaborating with partners. So there's a whole wide range of stakeholders that need to be involved in conservation of migratory waterbird, from decision makers to the users. So at the level of the governments, they play a coordinating role, an overarching coordinating role, because the government accedes to the agreement, to the convention, to whichever treaty, and has the obligation to. So you nominate your national focal point, which is your first obligation towards implementing, and then implementation can kick off with someone having an overarching and coordinating role and responsibility for this. There, the government is also the one who has to make sure there's a legal backing for implementation, mainstream provisions into the national legislation, so domestic legislation, policies, and so on, to ensure that any action which is being conducted is backed up by the provisions at the national level as well. Provide the necessary resources from the human resources. If we don't have a focal point, then there's no one dedicated to implement and to coordinate the other partners which need to be involved. Financial resources and material resources. Do you need resources to go into the field and monitor water birds? Do you need park rangers to be involved in monitoring at the different sites of key importance for water birds in your country? So the government really plays this overarching, very crucial role. The government cannot work on its own. They need the NGOs to support them, and the NGOs serve like an implementing arm at the national level for the governments. In most countries so far in the African region, we have seen an increase in collaboration between the governments and NGOs involved in bird conservation. And the NGOs are they also have sometimes quite often a stronger technical background in bird conservation. And they're very good at also awareness raising, so sensitizing on bird conservation issues and advocacy work, which is also very supporting of towards the governments. We have the example of the National BirdLife Partners, which exist in many countries, and they have the expertise for delivering water bird conservation action on the ground, and they do work very closely, quite more often than not, with the governments, and this is very useful. The academia, we mentioned there's research and monitoring needs on the water bird conservation as included in our action plan and our strategic plan. And we need the academia on our side. So are you developing research projects at the universities? Are you incorporating water bird conservation in the curriculum for training the future generation of conservationists, for example? And the civil society, it goes without saying, they play a key role, either as users of the natural resources, be it for hunting, tourism. Are they aware of the importance and value of these resources, and are they able to use them sustainably? If they are aware, then sustainable use would definitely be achieved. And this is one of the goals of AEWA, achieving sustainable use of the resources which are available for use. Thank you. So implementation is assessed mainly through the national reports. So it's addressing both questions directly and doesn't make sense going back. These reports are submitted by the contracting parties to every meeting of the AEWA parties, which happens every 3 years so far. Once there was a 4-year cycle, which was a test cycle, but it's generally every 3 years. The information provided in the national reports helps the Secretariat to conduct an agreement-wide assessment of the level of implementation and delivery of the objectives of AEWA, from the strategic plan to the AEWA text and action plan. The quality, of course, of such an assessment depends solely on the rate of submission of national reports, how many parties have submitted their reports. If only half the parties submit, then we are assessing on a half-party basis. So not all parties then would be assessed. So this would limit the quality of the assessment. But also on the quality of the report submitted. Is the information submitted fully, completely, and useful? This would all determine the usefulness of the assessment. The Secretariat ensures on its part that the format for submitting these national reports is available on time for the parties. So the meeting of the parties defines how soon before the meeting of the parties should this reporting format be submitted, and the Secretariat makes sure this is done on time, working together with the technical committee on this. The Secretariat also assesses the report submitted and provides an analytical report to the meeting of the parties, so to every meeting of the parties, on the outcomes of the assessment. So what is the use of these national reports? It's not just an additional burden on the parties because you're a party to AEWA, then you have to report. But the national reports serve as a tool to assess compliance with the obligations of AEWA at the national level and at the agreement level. Yes, we do an agreement-wide analysis, but we also provide for each country where you stand with delivery of the different obligations. And this helps the agreement on one end to define future priorities for implementation, but also helps the party to follow up future implementation. Where am I lagging in implementation as a party? Where do I need to make more effort? Where are the gaps? And this helps the party to establish its future priorities. So this responds to the next question on what is the use of the national report. Excuse me. In addition to these national reports, AEWA has also established an implementation review process, IRP, through its resolution 4.6. This is a mechanism that supports the contracting parties with implementing the agreement through providing a process for reviewing issues that result from human activities that have a potential or existing negative effect on migratory water birds and their habitats or their sites. The process is coordinated by the AEWA Standing Committee. So the Standing Committee gives the mandate for, yes, we are going to, this case which was submitted is worthy of an AEWA implementation review process, but they are supported by the AEWA Secretariat, and there's the obligation to work in close collaboration with other multilateral environmental agreements. For example, AEWA has on many cases in the past conducted joint implementation review processes with the Ramsar Convention Secretariats. Similar process which is the Ramsar Advisory Missions, so field missions with a similar purpose. So basically, this implementation review process provides a very useful tool for the parties who, once this process is run, it's an independent review process. It results in recommendations to the contracting party, all the stakeholders involved in that party, on actions to address and/or mitigate the negative impacts. Provisions to guide and monitor the implementation of the agreement are also provided under paragraph 7.4 of the AEWA Action Plan, which instructs the Secretariat to coordinate with the technical committee and the parties to prepare international reviews. And one of such reviews, so on the implementation of the agreement, one of such reviews is a conservation status report, which we've already made reference to. And we have reviews on legislative issues, for example, the review on pertinent hunting and trade legislation. I also would like to mention here that these reviews are not something that are submitted, they are submitted at different intervals. So for example, the conservation status report is submitted to every meeting of the parties. And the review on the conservation status of, on the implementation and development of single species action plans is submitted to every second meeting of the parties. And the review on pertinent hunting and trade legislation, for example, is submitted to every third meeting of the parties. So they have different intervals at which these reviews are expected. They are expensive to produce, of course, but then there's a mandate for this. So it's also a means of assessing implementation and compliance with the agreement. We also have in collaboration with other organizations, we have data collection frameworks. For example, the International Waterbird Census coordinated by Wetlands International, and the Important Bird Area, which provides data that feeds into the AEWA Conservation Status Report. So these are other mechanisms run by other partners, but then they are contributing directly to assessing the status and level of implementation of the agreement in these countries. So we call on parties, of course, not to minimize or ignore contribution to these processes. For example, do conduct your annual waterbird census in the framework of the IWC, because this data would directly feed into the AEWA Conservation Status Report and assess the overall and national level status of migratory waterbirds covered under the agreement. At the level of AEWA, we mentioned just recently the coordinated collection of data is required on the ground to assess the occurrence of the species in these countries and the numbers of the species in order to be able to assess trends. Are they improving, increasing, or decreasing? And this has to happen across the agreement area in a coordinated manner. And this is conducted by Wetlands International or coordinated by them through this International Waterbird Census, which we just mentioned. With the impacts of COVID, there have been disruptions and interruptions in logistical aspects, so the ability to travel and go into the fields, the ability for people to meet and to conduct these counts. So this has quite some restricting effects on the availability of data for AEWA assessments. And beyond the disrupted field monitoring for species and their habitats, COVID-19 impacts have also disrupted overall implementation of the agreement in many other ways, given that many of the ongoing processes, both at the national and the agreement level, at the international level, have been delayed or have been postponed, the major one being meetings. The Secretariat's role is to organize a range of meetings at different levels, regional level, sometimes at national level, bringing together a few parties. Projects have been disrupted on the ground over the past year, and this means postponing activities and in some cases even losing funding or not being able to conduct activities at all. So this has a huge impact on the delivery of the agreement. So there's going to be, for example, in the assessment of the implementation of the AEWA Strategic Plan and Action Plan, I would expect significant retrogression in the delivery of the in the achievement or delivery of actions in the next assessment, which will be done next year in regard to the 8th meeting of the party for AEWA. Talking about zoonotic diseases, the issue was already recognized some 15 years ago in the framework of AEWA with the highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI. There was an outbreak of this that spread across most of the African Eurasian region. So it's in fact even more relevant to the objectives of the agreement since it has a direct and indirect impact on the conservation of migratory water birds. The HPAI crisis, for example, was tackled through the establishment of a coordinated and specialized task force, the Scientific Task Force on Avian Influenza and Wild Birds. AEWA is a member of this, and this was established in the, together with CMS, with a broad range of organizations involved in it. For example, the Food and Agricultural Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the World Conservation Society, Wetlands International, BirdLife International. And this was able to produce instructive guidelines and recommendations on how to address the spread of the highly pathogenic avian influenza. So zoonotic diseases is something, like you mentioned, crucial for the functioning of the agreement, like to be addressed, and the agreement definitely does look into this when it is of relevance for migratory water birds. Well, first of all, congratulations to any AEWA focal points who are involved in this course. It shows a very significant move to get more information, to get more awareness, and to be more equipped or better equipped with the functioning of multilateral environmental agreements, which would apply across all the MEAs. So for any CMS, AEWA or other CMS instrument focal point attending this course, indeed, congratulations. And I trust that there will be a lot learned from this and that they will be able to apply it also to the delivery of AEWA provisions. It would definitely supplement the existing tools or dedicated tools provided by CMS family, like I mentioned, the CMS National Focal Point Manual on a broader basis. I would also like to take the opportunity to send a kind reminder to the CMS family focal points, of course, including my AEWA focal points participating in this training, that the convention, the agreement belongs to them. It belongs to you. The Secretariat is of service to you and is willing and ready and available to support you in any way possible. So do not hesitate at all to contact the Secretariat. Make the best use of the resources and tools available, produced for your use, and contact us at any time by any means. And for the African countries participating, which are not yet a party to CMS and or to AEWA, and for which any of the CMS instruments is relevant. Of course, AEWA is relevant for all the African countries. Please, we look forward to welcoming you in the near future to the AEWA family, to the CMS family. We are willing to work with you, to work with your government towards advancing the accession process. Accession means closing gaps in implementation as well, because then you get the obligation and the mandate to implement the convention or the agreement. So we are looking forward to working closely with you. Do not hesitate to make that first contact, also keep in touch with the AEWA Secretariat and keep us informed about the accession process where we're already in touch with you, or to contact us to initiate the process. Thank you very much and good luck with the course.